I'm Gresham's Idam, and welcome back to Gresham Reads Graceling by Christian Cashore. You'll have to excuse in the background, Darkus decided now to wash his dishes. Yeah, I actually need to. The sink was getting a little cluttered. Very well, if you couldn't help it. Yeah, got an inspection in a couple days, so I needed to get it out of the way. True. Well, anyways, last time we had the meeting of the council, as well as a short fighting match between Poe, or Greening Grandmalion, which is apparently his true name, but Poe being a nickname. Perhaps, I'm not quite sure. But there was a short sparring match between Poe and Katza, which was quite interesting to see. And then the meeting between the council members for the discussion over who had kidnapped the grandfather Lynid, Prince Teeling, I believe it was? Forgive me, I was looking back to see if I could find. I believe it was Teeling. But no one was able to make a proper connection due to no one truly knowing. But let us continue, I should say. Forgive me, it is early morning for recording this. Chapter 10. He was a marvelous opponent. She couldn't get to him. She couldn't hit him where she meant to, or as hard as she wanted. He was so quick to block or to twist, so quick to react. She couldn't knock him from his feet. She couldn't trap him when their fight had devolved into a wrestling match on the floor. He was so much stronger than she, and for the first time in her life, she found her lesser strength to be a disadvantage. No one had ever gotten close enough for it to matter before this. He was so finely tuned to his surroundings and to her movements, and that was also part of the challenge. He always seemed to know what she was doing, even when she was behind him. I'll grant you don't have night vision if you'll grant you have eyes in the back of your head, she said once when she entered the practice room and he greeted her without looking around to identify her. What do you mean? You always know what's happening behind you. Katza, do you never notice the noise you make when you burst into a room? No one flings doors open the way you do. Perhaps your grace gives you a heightened sense of things, she said. He shook his head. Perhaps, but no more than your own. He still got the worst of their fights, because of her flexibility and her tireless energy, and mostly because of her speed. She might not hit him how she wanted, but she still hit him, and he suffered pain more. He stopped the fight once while she grappled to pin his arms and his legs and his back to the ground, and he hit her repeatedly in the ribs with his one free hand. "Doesn't it hurt?" he said, gasping with laughter. "Don't you feel it? I hit you possibly 12 times, and you didn't even flinch." She sat up on her heels and felt a spot below her breast. "It hurts, but it's not bad." "Your bones are made of rock. You'll walk away from these fights without a sore spot while I limp away and spend the day icing my bruises." He didn't wear his rings while they fought. He'd come without them the first day. When she'd protested that it was an unnecessary precaution, his face had assumed a mask of innocence. "I promised Gideon, didn't I?" he'd said, and that fight had begun with Poe ducking and laughing as Katza swung at his face. They didn't wear their boots either, not after Katza accidentally clipped him on the forehead. He had dropped to his hands and knees, and she saw at once what had happened. "Call Raph," she cried to Ol, who watched on the side. She'd sat Poe on the floor, ripped off her own sleeve, and tried to stop the flow of blood that ran into his dazed eyes. When Raffin gave him the go-ahead to fight a few days later, she'd insisted they fight barefoot, and in truth she had taken more care of his face since then. They almost always practiced in front of an audience, a scattering of soldiers or underlords. Ol, whenever he could, for the fights gave him so much pleasure. Gideon, though, he always seemed to grow grumpy as he watched, and never stayed long. Even Helda came on occasion, the only woman who did, and sat with wide eyes that grew wider the longer she sat. Randa did not come, which was pleasant. Katza was glad of his tendency to keep her at arm's length. They ate together most days after practicing, in her dining room, alone, or in Raffin's workrooms with Raffin and Ban. Sometimes at a table Raffin had brought into Tilif's room. Yeah, Tilif, that was it. The grandfather was still very ill, but company seemed to cheer and strengthen him. When they sat together talking, sometimes the silver and gold of Poe's eyes caught her off guard. She could not become used to his eyes. They muddled her, but she met them when he looked at her, and she forced herself to breathe and talk and not become overwhelmed. They were eyes. They were only his eyes, and she wasn't a coward. And besides, she didn't want to behave toward him, as the entire court behaved towards her. Avoiding her eyes awkwardly, coldly. She didn't want to do that to a friend. He was a friend, and in the final few weeks of summer, for the first time in her life, Randa's court became a place of contentment for Katza. A place of good hard work, and friends, and of friends. All spies moved steadily, learning what they could from their travels to Nander and Estel. The kingdoms, amazingly, were at peace. The heat and the closeness of the air seemed to bring a lull to Randa's cruelty as well. Or perhaps he was merely distracted by the flood of foods and wares that always washed into the city from every trade route at that time of year. Whatever the reason, Randa did not summon Katza to perform any of his nasty errands. Katza found herself daring to relax into summer's end. She never ran out of questions for Poe. "Where did you get your name?" she asked him one day as they sat in the grandfather's room, talking quietly so as not to wake him. Poe wanted a cloth wrapped with ice around his shoulders. Which one? I've got lots to choose from. Katza reached out across the table and helped him tie the cloth tight. Poe. Does everyone call you that? My brothers gave me that name when I was little. It's a kind of tree in Lyned, the Poe tree. In autumn, its leaves turn silver and gold. Inevitable nickname, I guess. Katza broke a piece of bread. She'd wondered if the name had been given fondly, or if it had been an attempt by Poe's brothers to isolate him, to remind him that he was a Graceling. She watched him pile his plate high with bread, meat, fruit, and cheese, and smiled as the food began to disappear almost as fast as he'd piled it up. Katza could eat a lot, but Poe was something else altogether. What is it like to have 6 older brothers? I don't think it was for me what it would be for most others, he said. Hand fighting is revered in Lyned. My brothers are great fighters, and of course, I was able to hold my own with them, even though I was small, and eventually surpassed them, every one of them. They treat me like an equal, like more than an equal. And were they also your friends? Oh yes, especially the younger ones. Perhaps it was easier then to be a Graceling fighter if one was a boy, or in a kingdom that revered hand fighting. Or perhaps Poe's grace had announced itself less drastically than Katza's had. Perhaps if Katza had 6 older brothers, she would also have 6 friends. Or maybe everything was different in Lyned. I've heard the Lyned castles are built on mountain peaks so high that people have to be lifted up to them by ropes, she said. Poe grinned. Only my father's city has the ropes. He poured himself more water and turned back to the food on his plate. Well, Katza said, are you going to explain them to me? Katza, is it too much for you to understand that a man might be hungry after you've beaten him half to death? I'm beginning to think part of your fighting strategy to keep me from eating. You want me weak and faint. For someone who's Lyned's finest fighter, she said, you have a delicate constitution. He laughed and put his fork down. Alright. How can I describe this? He picked up his fork again and used it to draw a picture in the air as he spoke. My father's city sits at the top of this enormous tall rock, tall as a mountain, that rises straight up from the plains below. There are 3 ways up to the city. One is a road built into the side of the rock, that winds around and around it slowly. The second is a stairway built onto one side of the rock. It bends back and forth on itself until it reaches the top. It's a good approach if you're strong and wide awake and don't have a horse. Though most who choose that route eventually tire and end up begging a ride from someone on the road. My brothers and I race it sometimes. Who wins? Where's your confidence in me? That you need to ask that question. You would beat us all, of course. My ability to fight has no bearings on my ability to run up a flight of stairs. Nonetheless, I can't imagine you allowing anyone to beat you at anything. Katza snorted. And the third way? The third way is the ropes. How do they work? Poe scratched his head. Well, it's fairly simple, really. They hang from a great wheel that sits flat on its side at the top of the rock. They dangle down over the edge of the rock, and at the bottom they're attached to platforms. Horses turn the wheel, and the wheel pulls the ropes, and the platform rises. It seems a terrible amount of trouble. Mostly everyone uses the road. The ropes are only used for great shipments of things. And the whole city sits up in the sky. Poe broke himself another piece of bread and nodded. But why would they build a city in such a place? Poe shrugged. I suppose because it's beautiful. What do you mean? Well, you can see forever from the edges of the city. The fields, the mountains and hills. To one side, the sea. The sea, Katza said. The sea put an end to her questions for a moment. Katza had seen the lakes of Nander, some of them so wide she could barely make out the opposite shore. But she'd never seen the sea, nor could she imagine water that rocked and crashed. Wait, I skipped a line, forgive me. But she'd never seen the sea. She couldn't imagine that much water. Nor could she imagine water that rocked and crashed against the land, as she'd heard the sea did. She stared absently at the walls of Tilith's small room, and tried to think of it. You could see 2 of my brother's castles from the city, Poe said, in the foothills of the mountains. The other castles are beyond the mountains, or too far to see. How many castles are there? 7, just as there are 7 suns. Then one is yours, the smallest one. Do you mind that yours is the smallest? Poe grabbed an apple from the bowl of fruit on the table. I'm glad mine is the smallest, though my brothers don't believe me when I say so. She didn't blame them for disbelieving. She'd never heard of a man, not even her cousin, who didn't want to have as large a holding as he could have. Gideon was always comparing his estate to that of his neighbors, and when Raph enlisted his complaints about Thigpen, he never neglected to mention a certain disagreement over the precise location of the Midland's eastern border. She'd thought all men were like that. She thought she wasn't like that because she wasn't a man. I don't have the ambitions of my brothers, Poe said. I've never wanted a large holding. Never wanted to be a king or an overlord. No, Katza said. Nor have I. I've thanked the hills countless times that Raffen was born the son of Randa, and I only his niece, and his sister's daughter at that. My brothers want all that power. They love to get wrapped up in the disputes of my father's court. They actually revel in it. They love managing their own castles and their own cities. I do believe sometimes that they all wish to be king. He leaned back in his chair and absently ran his fingers along his sore shoulder. My castle doesn't have a city. It's not far from a town, but the town governs itself. It doesn't have a court either. Really, it's just a great house that'll be my home from the times when I'm not traveling. Katza took an apple for herself. You intend to travel? I'm more restless than my brothers, but it's so beautiful, my castle. It's the most wonderful place to go home to. It sits on a cliff above the sea. There are steps down to the water, cut into the cliff. The balcony is hanging over the cliff. You feel as if you'll fall if you lean too far. At night, the sun goes down across the water, and the whole sky turns red and orange, and the sea to match it. Sometimes there are great fish out there, fish of impossible colors. They come to the surface and roll about. You can watch them from the balconies. And there's the first nod to the story Fire. What? What are you talking about? When you get to the story, you'll find out. If you're sure, Darkus. I wonder what he means. You can watch them from the balconies, and in winter the waves are high, and the wind will knock you down. You can't go onto the balconies in winter. It's dangerous and wild. Forgive me. Grandfather, he said suddenly. He jumped up and turned to the bed, informed that his grandfather had awoken. Katza thought wryly by the eyes in the back of his head. You speak of your castle, boy, the old man said. Grandfather, how are you feeling? Katza ate her apple and listened to them talk. Her head was full of the things Poe had said. She hadn't known there were sights in the world so beautiful a person would want to spend an age staring at them. Poe turned to her then. A torch on the wall caught the gleam of his eyes. She focused on breathing. I have a weakness for beautiful sights, he said. My brothers tease me. Your brothers are the foolish one. Oh, wait, wrong one. Your brothers are the foolish ones, Tilov said, for not seeing the strength in beautiful things. Come here, child, he said to Katza. Let me see your eyes, for they make me stronger. And his kindness brought a smile to her face, though his words were nonsense. She went to sit beside Grandfather Tilov, and he and Poe told her more about Poe's castle, and Poe's brothers, and Roar's city in the sky. Chapter 11. What was that, Darkus? I don't know. What happened over there? Darkus, did you put something down here? Forgive me for that. But apparently Darkus decided to leave a dish on the shelf of this, and I bumped into it to knock it off. Darkus, come get this plate. Yeah. And here. Sorry for that interruption. Chapter 11. How far is Giddens' estate from Randa City? Poe asked her late one morning. They sat on the floor of their practice room, drinking water and resting. It had been a good session. Poe had returned the day before from a visit to Nander, and Katza thought the time apart had been good for them. They came together again with a new sharpness. It's near, in the west. A day's journey, perhaps, Katza said. Have you seen it? Yes, it's large and very grand. He doesn't get home often, but he still manages to keep it well. I'm sure he does. Gideon had come to their practice today. He had been their only visitor, and he hadn't stayed long. She didn't know why he came, when it always seemed to put him in a bad humor. Katza lay on her back and looked up at the high ceiling. The light poured into the room from the great east-facing windows. The days were beginning to shorten. The air would crispen soon, and the castle would smell of wood and burning in the fireplaces. The leaves would crackle under her horse's hooves when she went riding. It had been such a quiet couple of weeks. She would like a council task. She'd like to get out of the city and stretch her legs. She wondered if Ol had any news about Grandfather Tilef yet. Maybe she could go to Wester herself and poke around for information.
How will you answer Gideon when he asks you to marry him?
Poe asked.
Will you accept?
Katza sat up and stared at him. That's an absurd question.
Absurd? Why?
His face was clear of its usual smiles. She didn't think he was teasing her. Why in the Midlands would Gideon ask me to marry him? His eyes narrowed.
Katza, you're not serious.
She looked at him blankly, and now he did begin to smile.
Katza, don't you know Gideon's in love with you?
Katza snorted. Don't be ridiculous. Gideon lives to criticize me. Poe shook his head and his laugh began to rumble from his chest.
Katza, how can you be so blind? He's completely smitten. Don't you see how jealous he is? Don't you remember how he reacted when I scratched your face?
An unpleasant feeling began to gather in her stomach. I don't see what that has to do with it. And besides, how would you know? I don't believe Lord Gideon confides in you. He laughed.
No,
he said.
No, he certainly doesn't. Gideon trusts me about as much as he trusts Murgon. I imagine he thinks any man who fights you as I do is no better than an opportunist and no worse than a thug.
You're deceived, Katza said. Gideon feels nothing for me.
I can't make you see it, Katza, if you're determined not to see it.
Poe stretched onto his back and yawned.
All the same, I might think up a response if I were you, just in case you were to propose.
He laughed again.
I'll have to ice my shoulder as usual. I'd say you won again today, Katza.
She jumped to her feet. Are we done here?
I suppose. Are you hungry?
She waved him off and marched to the door. She left him lying on his back in the light of the windows and ran to find Raffen. Katza burst into Raffen's workrooms. Raffen and Bond sat at a table, huddled together over a book. Are you alone? Katza asked. They looked up, surprised. Yes, he's getting in love with me. Raffen blinked and Bond's eyes widened.
He's never spoken to me about it,
Raffen said.
But yes, I think anyone who knows him would say he's in love with you.
Katza slapped her hand to her forehead. Of all the fool... How can he... She paced to the table. She turned and paced back to the door.
Has he said something to you?
Raffen asked. No, Poe told me. She spun towards Raffen. And why did you never tell me?
Cat.
He sat back from his book.
I thought you knew. I don't see how you could not. He makes himself your escort every time the king's business takes you away from the city. He always sits beside you at dinner.
Randa decides where we sit at dinner.
Well, and Randa probably knows Raffen hopes to marry you,
Raffen said. Katza paced to the table again, clutching her hair. Oh, this is dreadful. Whatever shall I do?
If he asks you to marry him, you'll say no. You'll tell him it's nothing to do with him. You'll tell him you're determined not to marry, that you don't wish children. Whatever you need to say so he understands it's nothing to do with him.
I wouldn't marry Gideon to save my life, Katza said. Not even to save yours.
Well,
Raffin's eyes were full of laughter.
I'd leave that part out.
Katza sighed and walked again to the door.
You're not the most perceptive person I've ever known, Kat,
Raffin said.
If you don't mind my saying so. Your capacity for missing the obvious is astonishing.
She threw her arms into the air. She turned to go. She turned back to him suddenly at a shocking thought. You're not in love with me, are you? He stared at her for a moment, speechless. Then he burst into laughter. Ban laughed too, though he tried valiantly to hide it behind his hand. Katza was too relieved to be offended. All right, she said. I suppose I deserved that. My dear Katza, Raffin said.
Gideon is so very handsome. Are you sure you won't reconsider?
Raffin certainly is a bit of a jokester, wouldn't you agree, Gresham? He certainly seems to be. But enough interrupting, please.
Right, sorry, go ahead.
Raffin and Ben clutched their stomachs and guffawed. Katza waved their nonsense away. They were hopeless. She turned to go.
Council meeting tonight,
Raffin said to her back. She raised her hand to show that she'd heard. She closed the door on their laughter.
There's very little happening in the Seven Kingdoms, Ol said. We've called this meeting only because we have some information about Prince Tilif we can't make any sense of. We were hoping you'll have some ideas.
Ban had joined them for this meeting because the grandfather was well enough now to be left alone on occasion. Katza had taken advantage of Ban's broad chest and shoulders and seated him between herself and Gideon. Gideon could not possibly see her, but just in case, she'd positioned Raffin between them as well. Ol and Poe were across from her. Poe sat back in his chair, his eyes glimmering in the corner of her vision, no matter which way she looked.
Lord David gave us true information,
Ol said. Neither Nander or Estel knows anything of the kidnapping. Neither was involved, but now we're almost certain that King Byrne of Wester was also innocent.
Could it be Murgon then?
Gideon asked. But with what motive? Katza asked. He has no motive, Raffin said.
But then, he has no less motive than anyone else. It's what we keep coming up against. There's no motive for anyone to have done this. Even Poe, Prince Greening, has been able to come up with none.
Poe nodded.
My grandfather's only importance is to his family.
And if someone had it in mind to provoke the Lined royal family, Ol said, wouldn't they reveal themselves eventually? Otherwise, the power play has become pointless.
Has Tilif said anything more?
He said they blindfolded him, Poe said, and drugged him.
He said he was on a boat for a long time, and the land travel was shorter in comparison, which suggests his captors took him east by boat from Lined, possibly to one of the southern Sundaran ports, and then up through the forest to Murgon City. He said that when he heard them speak, he believed their accents to be southern. It does suggest Sunder and Murgon, Gideon said. But it didn't make sense. None of the kings had reason, but Murgon even less. Murgon worked for others, and his sole motivation was money. Everyone at the table, everyone in the council knew that. Poe, Katza said, your grandfather had no argument with your father or any of your brothers. Your mother? None, Poe said. I'm sure of it. I don't see how you can be so sure, Gideon said. Poe's eyes flashed to him. You'll have to take my word, Lord Gideon. Neither my father nor my brothers, nor my mother, nor anyone else at Leiden court was involved in the kidnapping. Poe's word is good enough for the council, Raffen said. And if it wasn't Byrne, Drawden, Thigpen, Randa, or War, that leaves Murgon. Poe raised his eyebrows. Have none of you considered the King of Monsey? A king with a reputation for kindness to injured animals and lost children, Gideon said. Come out of his isolation to kidnap his wife's aging father? A bit unlikely, don't you think? We've made inquiries and uncovered nothing, Ol said. King Lek is a peace-loving man. Either it's Murgon or one of the kings. He's keeping a secret even from his own spies. It may have been Murgon, Katza said, or it may not. Either way, Murgon knows who's responsible. If Murgon knows, then the people closest to him know. Couldn't we find one of Murgon's people? I could make him talk. Not without revealing your identity, my lady, Ol said, but she could kill him. Gideon said, after she questioned him. Now hold on, Katza held up her hand. I said nothing of killing. But it's not worth the information, Katza, Raffen said, for you to interrogate someone who will recognize you and speak of it to Murgon afterwards. Greening should be the one to do it anyway, Gideon said, and Poe's cool eyes flicked to him again. Murgon wouldn't question the motivation of a Lynid prince. Murgon would expect it of him. In fact, I don't see why you haven't done it already, Gideon said to Poe, if you wish to so much to know who's responsible. Katza was too irritated to care about her strategic seeding plan. She leaned around Raffen and Bond to address Gideon. It's because Murgon can't know that Poe knows Murgon was involved, she said. How would Poe explain that knowledge without incriminating us? Well, that's just why you can't question Murgon's people, Katza, unless you're willing to kill them afterwards. Gideon thumped his hand on the table and glared at her. All right, Raffen said. All right, we're going in circles. Katza sat back, seething. Katza, Raffen said. The information isn't worth the risk to you or to the council, nor, I think, is it worth the violence. She sighed inwardly. He was right, of course. Perhaps it'll be worth it someday in the future, Raffen said. But for now, Grandfather Teal'c is safe, and we've seen no sign from Murgon or anyone else that he's being targeted again. Poe, if there are steps you wish to take, that's your affair, though I'd ask you to discuss it with us first. I must think on it, Poe said. Then the matter is closed for now, Raffen said, until we learn something new, or until Poe comes to a decision. Ol, is there anything else on the table? Ol began to speak of a Westeran village that had met a Nandarin raiding party with a pair of catapults, given to them by a Westeran lord, who was friend to the council.
The Nandarin raiders had fled, thinking they were being attacked by an army. There was laughter at the table, and Ol began another story. But Katza's thoughts wandered to Murgon and his dungeons, to the Sundarin forest that likely held the secrets of the kidnapping. She felt Poe's gaze and she glanced at him across the table. His eyes were on her, but he didn't see her. His mind was elsewhere. He got that look sometimes when they sat together after their fights. She watched his face. The cut on his forehead was no more than a thin red line now. It would leave a scar. She wondered if that would rankle his lined vanity, but then she smiled within herself. He really wasn't vain. He hadn't cared a bit when she'd blackened his eye. He'd done nothing to hide the gash on his forehead. And besides, no vain person would choose to fight her day after day. No vain person would put his body at the mercy of her hands. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows again. His manners were so careless. Her eyes rested on the shadows in the hollows of his neck, then rose to his face again. She supposed he would have reason to be vain. He was handsome enough, as handsome as Gideon or Raffin, with his straight nose and the set of his mouth, and his strong shoulders, and even those gleaming eyes. Even they might be considered handsome. His eyes came back into focus and then looked into hers. Then something mischievous in his eyes, and a grin, almost as if he knew what she was thinking. Exactly what she decided about his claims to vanity. Katza's face closed, and she glowered at him. The meeting ended, and chairs scraped. Raffin pulled her to the side to speak of something. She was grateful for the excuse to turn away. She wouldn't see Poe again until the next fight, and the fights always returned her to herself. So this one took a little bit longer to get through. These chapters seem to have been slightly longer than the others, aside from the first one, of course. But it's quite interesting seeing Katza's working relationship, I suppose, at the moment, develop with Poe, as well as the reveal of Gideon's feelings for Katza, which Katza seems reluctant to act upon. It is quite interesting to hear about Katza's beliefs. How she refuses to wed or bear children. I wonder what the reasoning behind that is. Perhaps it is because she, like many others, sees herself as something unnatural, perhaps? Primarily due to her grace, I'm assuming. But it is really difficult to know for sure. Perhaps it'll be later on in the story. But until then, the video has gone on for long enough, so I believe I will call it here. I thank you all for joining me for these 2 chapters. If you enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below, telling your favorite part. If you enjoy the content Darkus and myself provide, do subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when we upload once more. The story truly is fascinating, and I can't wait to continue it. But that shall call it for this. And I am Gresham, and I am signing out.